Hi everyone, this is Joanne Dunbar and I am doing my Module 5 discussion. So I'm just going to jump right in. This week's readings have to do with social learning perspectives. And so the first discussion question was to pick two social learning theories and models discussed in Chapter 8 and explain how they're reflected in literacy research and instruction. Now, one thing I kind of figured out this week is I've mentioned before in my videos that I got the second edition of the text. The chapters I have discovered are a little bit off from the third edition, which Dr. Griffin is using and going off of. So I kind of had to figure out, okay, so the chapter that I read, chapter 8, does not have social learning perspectives in it. So I had to go back to the chapter that did. So once again, the page numbers are going to be a little different from the third edition. But these are all from the chapter on social learning perspectives. So the first perspective that I'm going to discuss is social constructivism, which was discovered or theorized by Lev Vygotsky. And Vygotsky is somebody who I actually learned about in undergrad, but mostly in regards to his zone of proximal development. We didn't really flesh out the other components, the social learning components of his theories so much. So that was kind of a neat connection for me to make, is that he had lots of other ideas beyond just the zone of proximal development. But basically, according to the text on page 128 in my edition, it's saying Vygotsky suggested that cognitive development depends much more on the interactions with the people in the child's world and the tools that the culture provides to support thinking. Children's knowledge, ideas, attitudes, and values develop through interactions with others. So this theory is kind of saying that learning really hinges upon those social interactions with others, and specifically on the agreed upon sign systems that different cultures use for things such as language. Another quote from the text on page 128, Vygotsky argued that children's learning is most affected by their mastery of language, as evidenced by their mastery of sign systems, such as the alphabet, words, listening, speaking, and writing. Vygotsky postulated that it is through the use and manipulation of these signs that children have the tools to think about and respond to the world. So whatever the agreed upon signs, such as language, happen to be, those largely shape children's learning as they become more and more literate or accustomed to those sign systems. And then moving on into the zone of proximal development, it's defined in the text as the ideal level of task difficulty to facilitate learning, which, according to Vygotsky, is the level at which a child can be successful with appropriate support. So this idea is that every learner has kind of this sweet spot along a continuum of content that is, on one end, too easy versus too rigorous. If you think about it in a spectrum, there's this ideal spot where it's a balance of ease versus rigor, and that's where a child learns the best. So that's where differentiation really comes into play. I think that concept is kind of founded upon, based upon the zone of proximal development, because every learner has that, and it's not going to be the same for every learner. And I know that in my classroom there's always room for improvement as far as, am I making sure that every student is learning in their own zone of proximal development. Social constructivism also relies heavily on scaffolding, and so that's kind of just like the different levels of support that the learner receives in order to be introduced to new content. Um, and I thought it was an interesting connection between Vygotsky's theory and the idea of scaffolding, and the different levels of support that children receive according to their zone of proximal development, and the article that we read about using multimodal learning for the purpose of scaffolding. I'm going to go to that article, the article by Benjamin Botch and Megan Henning. I don't know if I said those names right. But on page 582, the Lion King example with the teacher who is giving she is teaching lessons on certain parts of the life cycle, and I'm trying to find it. I'm trying to find the part where it actually talks about the content that she is tackling. So she's got high school students, 11th and 12th grade, environmental studies, and she is able to start out with a clip from The Lion King to kind of activate background knowledge. And it says, although Megan assumed that most students would have previously seen the clip of Mufasa and Simba discuss the circle of life, she wanted them to engage in discussion about the particular words Mufasa says. Everything you see exists in a delicate balance. We are all connected, and from the crawling ant to the leaping antelope. The clip was not just used as a hook to interest students in the topic. Instead, the analysis of Mufasa's words elevated students' thinking and prompted them to begin questioning their basic understanding of how a species is defined. The clip evened the playing field of shared knowledge by helping the students who had no prior content of thinking about species. So just the environmental aspect that she's trying to teach about different species and the food chain or whatever it was, she introduced that background knowledge by playing a video from a children's movie. And then that social interaction of discussing definitely helped solidify, okay, so this is what we're going to be thinking about, or this is the type of content that we are about to dive into a little bit deeper. So that is an interesting tie-in, and using the multimodal learning of, we're not just looking at written text, but we're using different genres or different mediums to be exposed to a particular set of ideas, a particular content. I'm going to move on to my next social learning perspective, which is social cognitive theory. This was posed by Albert Bandura, and according to our text on page 130, it says, this general theory of human behavior combines features of behaviorism with those of social learning. Bandura's primary premise in creating social learning theory was that a behavioral explanation of learning did not take into account the phenomenon of vicarious learning, the notion that people learn from observing others. And so this goes on to say that people learn best by watching others do something. And if this were not so, we would never learn anything unless we did it or experienced it ourselves. Obviously, this is not true. So watching someone else do something is a huge entry point into learning how to do something. So I had an interesting connection in my own teaching this week. That kind of ties in with the multimodal, there we go, multimodal learning idea as well, I would say. I had a lesson that I had to give to my ELA students on how to construct a constructed response paragraph using text evidence from a few different articles. And we were a little bit behind on schedule from where we needed to be because we've got a common assessment coming up in a couple of weeks. So we were about half a day behind, and I had booked the computer lab on this particular day, which was yesterday, because we were supposed to be in the lab typing the paragraph on that day. But before I could give them the opportunity to type the paragraph, I needed to teach them how to first organize the paragraph on a graphic organizer. And so since I had not gotten to that yet, and I had the computer lab for a class period, I started thinking, how can I teach them this, especially on a day when I have them last period of the day on a Friday, okay, and this class goes kind of crazy when it's last period of the day on a Friday. And how can I get them engaged enough to be able to construct this paragraph on this organizer and then type it in a class period? Because I was worried if we started out in the classroom, it's 50 minutes long. Start out in the classroom, I get them settled, I'm doing this on the document camera, and they're supposed to be following along. We've all got to finish and then migrate to the computer lab and start typing, all in a 50-minute class period on a Friday afternoon. So I decided to try something different. I made a video of myself. I used the software that we have with our document cameras in our classrooms to make a video of myself teaching how to enter your information. We've already done some previous research, reading some different articles, and they had their research recorded. So kind of a tutorial video showing this is how you fill out this organizer prior to typing it. This is how you set up this constructed response and include your text evidence. It's about a 10-minute video that I made. So I had them all come to the computer lab, and I posted the video on Edmodo, which our school uses highly, and had them watch it individually. They had headsets, they watched it, and then filled out their own as they watched it. I wasn't sure how it would go. It went awesome because they were all engaged, and they were all going at their own pace. And I think that was a big deal, that they could pause the video. I was still in there to offer support to anybody who needed it, so I could walk around and answer questions. But they're all watching this video, and I'm watching them fill out their own organizer as they're watching me do it on the video. And I kind of looked at a few of them afterwards, and it really looked like they got it. So I think that is an example of this learning theory, the social cognitive theory, because I knew that in order for them to be able to fill out this organizer, they had to watch me do it first. But on the last period of the day on a Friday afternoon, trying to keep the whole class's attention and go at a pace that everybody can follow was going to be a challenge when we had so much to still accomplish. So that was a cool example. I am taking up a lot of time, so I'm going to go ahead and move to the next discussion question, which was, how can educators practically apply literacy-based research through professional learning communities? So from this, or for this question, obviously I'm going to pull mainly from the article by Stahl, Catherine Stahl, I think was the name, Professional Learning to Bolster Comprehension. And so I just had a few takeaways from this article. First of all, just the note about, in an era of increasingly high-stakes teacher evaluations, embedded PD functions as a vital tool for both administrators and teachers. So just the idea that PLCs can be an important vehicle for professional development, that is important because we are expected to develop and grow as educators, and that can be tough when we have so much going on. So PLCs allow collaborative time for that, for those types of PD tasks that can be shared. And once again, even as adults and as teachers ourselves, we are operating under, I would say, Vygotsky's theory of we're doing something together and we're learning together, so we're going to grow at a better rate than if we were just doing everything individually. So it listed a few on page 4 of the article. It listed a few different activities that PLCs can do, including discussing selected readings, watching videos together, and then most commonly doing tasks together. I know for me that's what I experience through PLCs most. Is just that we're planning together and we're making copies for each other and we're splitting up the workload. And it was interesting that in the article it actually said that splitting up the workload in that way can reduce the workload by 75% when sharing tasks. And so I think that's a huge part of PLCs. I have never done a book study with a PLC. I think, to be honest with you, that sounds kind of daunting to have one more thing. Like, hey, you have to read this book together, do it during PLCs, because my plannings, probably 3 days a week at least, are taken up by various meetings. So I don't know how I feel about that, but if you had time for it, I think it could be a very valuable tool on reading different books, if you had time. And then it gave the example of, for literacy in particular, creating integrated disciplinary units. I know that's something that my school does. As PLCs, we come up with multidisciplinary units that can fit in with other PLCs of other subject areas. We have STEM week coming up in 2 weeks, and so each PLC has come up with kind of a theme that is supposed to fit in with the other themes. And actually, as a reading teacher at my school, reading is meant to directly supplement other content areas. So my PLC collaborates with the science and the social studies teachers in particular, so that we can be giving texts that go along with the things that they're learning in those classes. And then also examining data and writing samples. I know my ELA PLC, we regularly look at data, and this kind of drives our decisions on what we need to cover again, what we need to make sure we revisit or reassess. And we use something called Cobb Teaching and Learning System. I'm sure other counties have something similar, which is kind of a way to easily look at data on common assessments. And I like the example that the text gave about selecting texts for students to read, and coming up together with different questions that go along with each text, because just even that process of coming up with those lessons together, first of all, you've got 4 or 5 brains to pick from, and so there's strength in that. And then also the workload, once again, is reduced because you're not planning only your own lessons. So those are just some of the ways that PLCs are beneficial, not only in literacy, but just in education in general. Once again, I think that's a valuable tie-in just to our social learning perspectives for this module, that learning doesn't happen in isolation. It is definitely a social process. No matter which social learning perspective you prefer to adhere to, or multiple ones, it's very clear that social learning is a big part of learning. So that's going to conclude my video. Thanks for watching, and we are getting close. And so good luck to everybody, and I hope everyone has a good week.